There are some things that general revelation is more clear on than Scripture. And in that case, we're going to use the clear of general revelation to help us interpret the unclear of Scripture, and vice versa. There's certain things that Scripture is much more clear on, think salvation, soteriology, things like that, than general revelation, obviously. And in those cases, we're going to use the clear in Scripture to interpret the unclear in general revelation.
He says, by the scriptural and confessional definitions, general revelation is a reliable standard for nothing, and every Christian doctrine must be derived from Scripture or from nowhere. The argument that I hear sometimes from presuppositionalists is that, so they say, well, Scripture, because it's spoken, it's more clear than general revelation. And, we've addressed this in past videos, but the idea is that, the way we'd answer that is we would say, well, certain things are very clear in Scripture, certain things are very clear in general revelation, and then there are things in both that are not very clear. But we use the total of Scripture to interpret the parts that are not that clear. We use the total of nature as we interpret unclear questions in nature. And we also use Scripture to interpret nature and nature to interpret Scripture, because they're all revelation. They're all authoritative.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and the standard used for just Scripture, for just studying Scripture, everybody will admit that there are certain things in Scripture that are unclear, especially in relation to more clear things. They'll say that there's less clear things and there's more clear things in Scripture. And the rule of thumb is typically, that everybody agrees with, is use the clear things to help you understand the unclear things, right? And we want to take that and do the exact same thing with general revelation and with Scripture combined at the same time. There are some things that general revelation is more clear on than Scripture. And in that case, we're going to use the clear of general revelation to help us interpret the unclear of Scripture, and vice versa. There's certain things that Scripture is much more clear on, think salvation, soteriology, things like that, than general revelation, obviously. And in those cases, we're going to use the clear in Scripture to interpret the unclear in general revelation.
When he says general revelation is a reliable standard for nothing, what he's doing there is he's throwing out the basic principles of hermeneutics, actually, because it's by general revelation that we know that A cannot be A and not A at the same time in the same sense. And that would be a hermeneutical principle that we bring in our interpretation of Scripture, as well as other, obvious ones, like the context. You have to know who's writing this and who's he saying it to and for what purpose, and what else has he said, those kinds of questions.
Not to mention grammar and the alphabet. You can't even get started reading anything, let alone Scripture, without general revelation, without having reliable standards in general revelation that actually give you something of value for you to come to Scripture and make something of it.
I think part of what's going on here is the idea of standard. It's a little bit unclear in what sense he wants to use the word standard, because general revelation is actually a source. Special revelation is a source. The standards would be reason and observation, because those are the processes by which human beings access the revelation. And they can be, and these are the things that are under our control, right? We don't have control over what God revealed, but we do have control over the process that we use to think about what he revealed. Are we going to pay attention? Are we going to reject contradictions? Those are things that we control. And so those are the things that, when you talk about standards, in other words, right policies for how to behave and think, that's where the idea of a standard comes into play.
Yeah, you say that the revelation itself is the standard by which you approach the revelation, is to assume that the revelation just pops right into your head without any effort on your part, right? And it sounds absurd. And if somebody treated Scripture that way, we would mock them, right? Because they would essentially just be like blindly running their finger over the page and then believing whatever came to their head without actually reading and engaging with the text. That it's the same way with general revelation. I think sometimes people think that the study of general revelation is just staring at like a tree and then whatever pops into your head, oh, that's general revelation, and it sounds stupid, and so like, oh, well, I'm not going to do that. Well, no, we're saying that there's a process. There are standards. There are hermeneutical and epistemological standards, just like with Scripture, for how to determine what is being communicated by God through what he has created.